Okay, it's live now.
Okay, so thank you everyone for coming out. We got a pretty good attendance today, so we really appreciate it. So welcome to the 40th anniversary of the Anti-W5 Movement Forum. My name is Ryan Chan. My co-facilitator is Ms. Susan Eng. We have our guests, Ms. Lillian Ma, Mr. Alan Lee, and Vince Wong, Mr. Vince Wong. So of course, we'd like to thank our sponsors, the Asia Law Society, the IHRP, International Human Rights Program, Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice, and Osler, Hoskin Harcourt for sponsoring this event. So if we'll get started.
Sure. Well, we're going to get started in just a couple of housekeeping. We're going to keep the presentations very short. We're going to expect a lot of engagement, so thank you for being here. We want you to hear what you have on your mind and the kinds of things that you'd like the organization to get involved with. We're going to start by giving you some background as to what the anti-W5 protest was. Don't be concerned that it was 40 years ago, that it's relevant to you. In fact, that's the tragedy of the story, is that it is now more relevant than any time before. And we named our event Fighting Fake News Then and Now. And you'll see as we go through how that came to be. I'm going to let Lillian Ma get started. What happened was, in 1979, a premier CTV program called W5 decided that they wanted to come to UT campus to develop a story that the positions that were available to Canadians were being taken by foreign students. To illustrate their story, they showed a young blonde girl who wanted to get into pharmacy with, I think her marks were around 72.
75.
Or 75. So all of you here at UT Law or anywhere in UT know that that's not an entry-level number. You have to get well over 80. But here she was the protagonist. And to show who was taking her place, they took a picture of several people of Chinese Canadian descent. And one of those people was now Dr. Lillian Ma. I'll let her explain to you who she was then and how she got involved in the first protest.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Can everybody hear me? I mean, I hope
You
my
should
voice
stand.
is. I stand. Okay. Well, I'm not very tall, but you see the entirety, 100%. What happened was, as Susan was saying, I came to Toronto in '77. In the States, I was in Canada in '67, but I went down to the States for a few years to do exchange. I drove up to U of T, and I was put into Sudan Wilson. If you guys know, is it still called Sudan Wilson residence? It's right on St. George. I don't know what they say. But as a result, I met a lot of students there, and a number of them were Chinese Canadian students, and so they invited me to go to, as you know, in the beginning of September, a welcoming new students, okay? And so I was invited to do some skits with the kids and to welcome new students. I was a scientist already at the biochemistry department at Faculty of Medicine. And I said, okay, I'll do that. And then I saw CTV, the TV film crew there. And I said to the president, why is it that we have a film crew? And they said, well, this is a public affairs program, and they want to introduce Chinese culture to the Canadian public. I said, okay, then they can film it. And then 2 weeks down the road, I went back to work, and my colleagues were saying, Lillian, we saw you on TV last night, but they weren't saying good things about you. I said, what? I was so shocked. And then the students gave me a call in the by phone and said, come to Hart House. We're going to have a meeting tonight because we saw the tape and blah, blah, blah. And I saw the tape and I was totally shocked. It's called the Campus Giveaway. And every time they say foreign, they show Chinese faces or Asian faces. Some of them could be Korean, Japanese, I don't know. But every time they say Canadian, they would show this white girl. And we were just shocked because we felt very, very upset because we were walking at U of T campus and we feel we don't belong. People will look at us and think that we're foreign students taking over the spaces. In fact, the people that were shown on the film, the pharmacy students that they showed in the class, they were either Canadians or what they call permanent residents, okay? Because you could not have entered pharmacy class if you're a foreign student. It was the rule at U of T at the time was like that. So we were very upset and we don't know what to do. We were, and none of us really know how to deal with something like that, except we feel very frustrated walking the campus and we were talking to each other, how could they do something like that? They got the research all wrong. And the number of students they quoted for foreign students is also wrong. Mr. Hollowell from the International Students Bureau was saying that's not the right thing. So U of T was upset too because they misrepresented their policy at the time.
So what did you do?
What did we do? Okay, wow, right there's Winnie. I happen to know her because she was a social worker that helped the Chinese community called the CCMA. And I knew her from the refugee, we helped the Vietnam refugees when they first came to Canada in 78, 79, I think those years. And we just, try to get clothing, just help them to resettle. So I said, we got this. We have to do something about it, but we don't know what to do. Most of them are students. I myself was a scientist, I knew nothing except working in the lab, okay? So none of us were lawyers or, so what? Luckily we got the social worker to help us. And she told us, go to Cecil Community Center. Do you know what Cecil Community Center is? It's on Cecil Street, okay? And it was an old synagogue, but it has been used by the community as a place for meeting, and they have social services there for the Chinese Canadian community. And as a result, we were able to get some people noted, and Joseph Wong, a whole bunch of people who worked in the refugee movement were able to help us to bring this.
So you were already organized in some way.
Yeah, we were, but I will tell you, it took us a very long time because we have to get across the country, right?
Right.
We have to get the news across the country. And so what we did is we translated the entire show into Chinese, and I was Helen Hutchinson, the lady who did the narrative, and somebody wrote it. Wrote
so you acted it out again?
Yeah, in a film, in Chinese, in video, because a lot of the parents, they are not necessarily fluent in English, and they don't even know that W5 exists. Right? So it was a long time. It took us 4 months to organize a rally, a protest. So it was not until January 26th that we were able to do a protest right across the country, not just in Toronto, but in Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, Montreal.
And what were your demands?
Just an apology.
Right.
We want them to apologize because CDB they have never apologized in an agricultural group.
What was the first apology like?
Oh, that was awful. That was in March. They apologized for getting the statistics wrong. So U of T accepted
Not the
that.
racism.
No, they did not understand why we were angry. That's basically
But
it.
U of T
right?
was satisfied that the statistics were
Yeah,
correct.
they were satisfied with the statistics, so they accepted it. And some of the people from the Chinese communities, they would tell us, oh, don't make noise, don't make too much noise. Don't, just accept it.
So you
But
didn't
no,
accept
but
the
we
apology.
did not accept it because I think Joseph was instrumental in that to make sure that we don't accept because you don't understand the stereotyping. Every time you say Chinese and foreign, you show Chinese faces. That's the whole point. And every time you say Canadian, then you show the white face as though we don't belong here, right?
So in the end, what happened?
Oh, they apologized in the end because we have an ace. We have a lawsuit against them. There were 5 students who actually volunteered to be the plaintiff, and some of them were in dentistry, some in pharmacy, some in different disciplines. And we lodged a complaint with the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Now that's the first time I heard of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, okay? And so we lodged that, and we got Ian Scott somehow, I don't know how, I think Joseph worked in mysterious ways, and we got Ian Scott to be our counsel. So, and we have one articling student among us who is on our committee, and that is Zhang Kai-Win, yeah. And he's still practicing law now in Scarborough. And it was great because he actually wrote the statement on claim and things like that, and launched this lawsuit with Ontario Human Rights Commission. And
But was that what started with, got the apology, or was it a nationwide protest that got the apology?
I think it's both. Not the protest, but we were, I think in April, we have been organized enough. I think Joseph wrote to, he flew to Calgary and all that. And they all come in April to Toronto to have a big conference because we want everybody to know what happened. And that we have to form a Trans-Canadian National Council so that we have a voice, because nobody, the difficulty was
And
that we didn't have
the
a
thing I
voice.
remember about that was that everybody came together as part of the protest.
Yeah.
They gave the apology, now we were all here, so we decided to have a conference.
No, the conference was going to happen, okay? Because we tell CTV, we're going to do this, okay? Because we had a lot of support from the media, especially the Chinese media. And we had Jojo Chindo, from City TV. In fact, we make so many coalitions. I mean, we make a lot of friends with people from different groups, and they were helping us. And I remember, Wilson Head from the National Black Coalitions, who's a professor at York University. George Bancroft, a black professor from the University of Education from here. Ubali. Dr. Ubali from Ontario Human Rights
So that was the formation of the Chinese Canadian National Council in 1980.
In April 16, they apologized.
Right.
And then we formed the council in April 22nd or 23rd.
So I'm going to move on now
Okay.
because Lillian was one of the first presidents of the CCNC, but one of the organization has been in existence since 1980, before most of you were born. And during that interim period, Ellen Lee was our national president. Now, as Lillian said, it was very difficult for any foreign student to get into U of T. U of T had plenty of students in those days from domestic sources, and they were not, as many universities are today, in dire need of a lot of money. There was a lot more public support in those days. So in order to get in as a foreign student, it was extremely difficult. You had to have extraordinary marks, and none of the people in that room with Lillian were in fact foreign students. On the other hand, Ellen Lee was a foreign student. In medicine?
Yeah.
In medicine, Ellen.
So I have a few pictures to show. So the first one is actually the NTW5 coverage in one of our newsletter. So I was a medical student, no, I was a high school student in Winnipeg, an international student waiting to get into med school, and I was desperate because I know that as a foreign student or international student, it's really, 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 really difficult. I think U of T had all of 5 quota in its 200-some plus medical student class. But I didn't realize about CCNC and all this organizing until I came to Toronto in even after 1981. I was very involved with the gay Asian community in Toronto, but I didn't get involved with the mainstream Chinese Canadian community because I was always feeling that our ethno-racial community do not accept me as a gay person. And I didn't know the progressive allies that existed in CCNC. But next slide. So that's just me as a student. Next slide. So then I graduated and I started working at Regent Park Community Health Center in downtown Toronto. And then next door to that, there is next slide. There is the Southeast Asian Service Center that just started to help the Southeast Asian immigrants in the area. And there I met Ms. Amy Gold, who is, next slide, who was a social worker at Wood Green at that time. And I was a fresh new physician out of med school working at the community health center. And together, we worked at together, and she was trying to recruit me for CCNC because she said that was 88, and she said that she was very upset because in 1986, when the human rights reform was happening in Ontario, CCNC actually refused to take a stand to support the reform to include sexual orientation as a ground for prohibition of discrimination. So she said that it's really important to have openly gay persons to be part of our coalition and to try to make those differences. So that's why I joined CCNC. So next slide. So actually, I thought I joined CCNC as one of its high points. Shortly after I joined, CCNC celebrated the 10th anniversary, and that was like a big, huge kind of climactic moment in CCNC's history. There's like 700 people in the banquet, and the governors general and every big shot politicians were there. But when I inherited CCNC's national presidency, the honeymoon was pretty short-lived. Mostly because another event that mirrors what we are experiencing now, which is, next slide. We'll skip and come back to this. So in 1989, as many of you know, there is the Tiananmen Square massacre happening, and CCNC actually decided to take up the job of supporting the students who claim refugee status as a result of the massacre. And that put us from being actually very close allies and darlings of the Chinese consulate to its enemies. And they started building a parallel national organization called the National Congress of Chinese Canadians, who has a lot of China trade connections, whose main job is to speak against everything CCNC stood up for. And so that's just to make our lives totally miserable. And so before then, we were also very active in the redress movement, which is a national movement, and we work very closely with the Japanese Canadian community and the Ukrainian community, and we were gathering a lot of momentum. But with the NCCC starting, and they trying to divide the community just like the same way they divided in the NTW5 movement, right? So it kind of makes our campaign very difficult. Next slide. So in the days that I was president, I always want to use this in an analogy. We feel like we are the queen with two colored faces. This is a Chinese legend when, this queen is actually a supreme warrior. And the king only loves her during wartime because she needs her to fight. And then in peacetime, when things are well, they just discarded her and, don't treat her well. So I think that's kind of CCNC in the Chinese Canadian community. They counted on us to fight for social justice, to take on really difficult issues. But then when things are well or the glamorous occasions, they don't want us there anymore. Next slide. But we persisted and we continued to work with many communities. And I think in the years that I was involved, there's 3 campaigns that I was particularly proud of, and I covered that quickly. So one is obviously the redress campaign. We worked from 1984 to 2006, 22 years it took us. Many generations, many reiterations, many national coalition building to finally get an apology and compensation for our seniors who paid the head tax and suffered through the Chinese Exclusion Act. Next slide. So finally in 2006, the government has issued formal apology and compensated the head taxpayers and their widows. The other campaign, and actually this is a campaign that is championed by our Toronto chapter, which is, And this is again a very timely thing, just like a few months ago, the same incidents happened in Toronto, right? And so Edmund Yu, one of the Chinese ex-medical student actually who suffered from mental health issues, was killed by police in a deserted bus, having suffered 6 shots to death. And so we built coalition with a lot of other community groups. I think there's like the Mental Health Coalition, a lot of people of color groups, the Black Action Defense Committee, I'm sure was involved because the black community suffered a whole lot of police violence. And we fight for justice for Edmund Yu. Next slide. And this is a thing that is particularly close to home, which is a campaign against homophobia that CCNC was an active member of. In 1995 or 6, actually, a Chinese tabloid published a very homophobic article, basically degrading the LGBT community, saying that should people afflicted with homosexuality have pride as a gay pride coverage. So we got together with our progressive allies in the Chinese Canadian community, but also in the broader community, and actually using the NTW5 model as inspiration to lobby for an official apology and redress. And within weeks, we were able to get them to publish a parallel issue and a formal apology. And next slide. And we had a press conference, and you can see Susan 20 years ago. And
It looks the same,
20
right?
years ago. And we also built coalitions with many of the other people of color community and organized a campaign called Love Embraces All, next slide, which promoted anti-homophobia amongst many ethno-racial communities who face common issues and struggles in their own communities. So these are some of the examples of how we fought together and built coalitions to fight for social justice.
Thank you. And Alan just sort of slipped over the fact that he went to medical school and finished. And then we just started on his work. This is a very high-achieving individual, as is Lillian, as is Vince, and they had time and enthusiasm for carrying on this work, which was another full-time job plus. And during this period of time, of course, I'm sure many of you will hear the messages from your parents and others, don't rock the boat, you should be happy to be here, don't get into these things that have nothing to do with you. Well, when we did the head tax campaign and got ultimately a settlement, and part of that settlement was a $20,000 ex gratia payment to survivors, people who paid the head tax, and their surviving spouses. Because mostly it was widows who were left and died after so many years. We estimated there might be 400 people across the country that might be qualified. Over 800 showed up, so they come when there's money in it. But everybody else works for 22 years so that they can get what they want. Vince is the youngest of our panel, but not to let you think that like the rest of us are a little bit older, but 40 years ago, we were like you, we were younger. Vince, representing you and speaking on your behalf, is a lawyer and worked with the Leo Clinic. And again, you would think that nowadays you don't have to do this, but Vince will tell us why it's still necessary.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll start a little bit with when I entered law school. I did U of T Law JD back in 2010. I entered in 2010, and like immediately I had like trouble. I didn't know, I couldn't point out exactly what it was, but I had trouble like fitting in, and it was just really weird. Like it wasn't. So I was trying to figure out what was going on, and it occurred to me when I was thinking about constitutional law, I think like first or second class, and it was David Schneiderman, who's still here and he still teaches, is a wonderful professor. And it was just, it was telling us about 1763 in Canada, and so I was like, okay, so you basically used the doctrine of discovery, something you made up, and like saying that nobody is here even though there were people here, and just like took the whole thing. And so now we're understanding the laws that are built. So I just couldn't. So there was all this other stuff, and it was taught in a very logical and very accessible manner. Schneiderman is a great professor, but I couldn't shake it. Like why? What is the authority by which, other than like, oh, the sovereign is great, the sovereign is good, okay. And then the other thing was like, so we did an absurd amount of reading in law school, as I'm sure you're all finding out right now, those current students. And I was just thinking about like, who's writing these like decisions of which we are bound by precedents to follow. And it's like, it's all old white folks, old white males, right? I mean, it's only since the 90s and 2000s where we have females, white females that we can read. But really, it just, I just couldn't and some of the reasoning was great, right? I mean, the jurisprudence was very good. But I would really like to hear some other voices telling me, what's the law could be and what's Canadian experience of other folks was in the law and in society. So I had no idea what was going on. I was really struggling, to be perfectly honest. And then in my third year, I had the fortune of inviting Avi Go, who's at the back there, to discuss this issue of the Chinese head tax and exclusion redress campaign. And because we're a law school and we're all law nerds, to discuss like the case, right, the arguments that you put forth in terms of reparation. And the funny thing is that, of course, that case was ultimately rejected by the Ontario Court of Appeal, but the political momentum that was built, the strength of the legal and moral arguments that were made both in the case and in the court of public opinion eventually culminated in the 2006 Canadian apology. And I just thought it was so strange that there was this incredible moment in Chinese-Canadian history, and like, how come I didn't know anything about it? Like, it was just wild to me. So I ended up articling and working at the Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic, and it was a very strange and wonderful experience because I got the chance to, and this room here is a very strange and wonderful experience because it's almost like you're learning your forgotten history, right? You finally learn the shoulders of the folks that you stand on. I mean, you think about America and the civil rights movement, where everybody kind of knows the reason why we're able to participate in educational institutions. Why? Because we're working off the work of the original strugglers. And many of the original strugglers are in this room right now. And there's these kind of long forgotten histories. But the second part was to kind of learn the power of the law to change people's lives. And this is something that I feel like is not taught properly, at least in U of T law, which is the only data point I have, is you have no idea how powerful this is, right? It's incredibly powerful, and it could be a piece of summary advice, it could be like a public legal education workshop, all the way to, take a full case. But for folks who are the most marginalized kind of in our communities, that don't speak the language or, face precarious immigration status, or, maybe like, we don't know if we can say anything, I might get kicked out of my house. The power of knowing the law, your education, is like almost like magic, right? And that is what I found the experience. Of course, there's limits to that, but that was the level, the dearth of services being given to the most marginalized folks in our community, and that was a real shock and an eye-opening moment to me, as you said, Susan. Like, why do we still need this? There's 99 reasons, 1,000 reasons why we still need this. So
right, and under this government, that's under threat, because you were talking about your time at the legal clinic, and that the finances there are being squeezed now. And so those things that you're talking about, the access, the support for people who are marginalized, using the law as it was meant to do, to help people, that access point is being squeezed as we speak. And we'll probably have a chance to talk about that later. Well, first of all, let me ask everybody to thank our panelists. It's your turn. First of all, do you have questions for the panelists, something that wasn't clear, maybe to bring it up to date? And we will have some questions for you as well as to what you think we should be doing next.
Was it settled out of court, the Human Rights Commission? Was there an adjudication, a judgment rendered in the case, the W5 case, or was it settled out of court?
I think there's a settlement. It was, you see that in the old days when you file something with the Ontario Human Rights Commission, you don't go to a hearing. They would try to get mediation, they would try to get resolution before it's referred to what's called a board of inquiry. Okay?
And some of that
It's
settlement
not the
was,
same like
the settlement was interesting because it wasn't there, they had to do reciprocal program.
Well, what happened was they, CTV agreed to do an apology, okay? That's number one. Number two, they would also give us like 15 minutes, another segment that we can produce, okay? But they will air it on W5, which is called White and Bright, which is a segment that was based on a study done by the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and the Canadian Labour Congress, because Dan Hill was from the Labour Congress and Alan Borowoy was from the Canadian Liberties Association, and they've done a study that like 90% of the employment agencies in Canada that they telephone say, I'm a U.S. company, but I only want to hire people that are white. Okay, so can you pre-screen them before they come to the interview? Because under the Ontario Human Rights Code in those days, they prohibit employers to not, they cannot discriminate, but they did not have employment agencies included.
And I just have one more question.
Yeah.
How would you respond to the criticism, this was just stupid, irresponsible journalism, much more than malicious intent or, picking a particular.
I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't know what their
There must have
intent
been
is.
editorial.
Yeah, I'm sure that there could be intent or there could not be intent, but if you look at the impact, right? I think it's more important to look at the impact and say, well, how do I feel, right? How do the students feel? If you have fake news, I mean, you can call it fake news like that, and it influences their career in the university. They will, they're not able to make friends because they will look at it differently,
Anyways, it's no
I-
excuse to
Yeah.
be ignorant of the law or be ignorant of the racism. It doesn't matter what they were thinking. This is what they did, and maybe they were swimming in a sea of racism, and this is the best they could think of. That could be the reason too, but that doesn't excuse them either. Another question? Yes.
I mean, a core part of human rights law is you don't need intent. Intent's not a required element. Just to be clear though, Lillian, was it only a Human Rights Commission complaint, or was
Yes.
there also a separate court action?
No, it's only a human
Okay.
commission complaint.
Okay.
Human Rights Commission. Next, yes, right there.
Have you read the Queen's two Asian articles?
Yeah, of course.
And so what's your opinion on that? Or
Vincent, what's your opinion of that? Well, it's a recent one. McLean's, Magazine, are you familiar with it?
Yeah, I am,
specifically?
yeah.
It said 2 Asian people here are familiar with that article.
I mean, it's just such a familiar rehash of like this, and I think, it was interesting. I think it was 2010 that McLean's run. I actually saw it on stands, and I was like, oh, what is this? Like, I started reading through it, and it was just, it's just interesting how things change and things like don't change at all, right? I mean, it's the same kind of rehashed arguments of, okay, well, these folks are you know, like the perception is that, the implication is that they're foreigners, right? Like you don't, you know, they're kind of taking seats from regular Canadians, and that's, you know, who is, I mean, okay, I mean, one of the issues is normativity, right? Like what is considered default, right, when we think about Canadian? And this goes on to like the conversations about, you know, old stock Canadians and this idea. But really, what I think the fight is always with what is the core of the society that we're trying to build, right? Is it going to be a society where there is a particular segment of the population that is going to be the default, right? And everybody is just kind of in the orbit of it, or do we, I don't know, so maybe this is like the young thing, but I don't know if you guys watch like Hassan Minhaj, like Homecoming King?
Yeah.
You know, like, so he's like a kind of a second gen Indian Muslim. And he was like, okay, so for our first generation, you know, it was kind of like, you know, keep silent, you know, just roll with it. You know, this is the racism that we face is going to be part of the price of admission, right? When you get to the second generation, it's like, screw that, right? We demand our equality, right? We have that, we have that kind of view. And I feel like for a lot of people that responded to the Two Asian article, the critiques were, although the issues were the same, I feel like the critiques were a little bit nuanced, and they were a little bit more broad-based, and they were more from a position of, hey, we have the right to demand equality, and this portrayal is extremely, you know, not only like racially problematic, but also just terrible journalism, as the gentleman mentioned.
That's right, but if you think about it, this is a premier Canadian magazine puts this on its front cover and thinks it's okay. I mean, that's where we start. We start with that premise, that this is just fine to do. And then they were surprised that there was a lot of pushback. And I think we're gonna have to keep surprising people for a while because they just never learn. Another question? Yes.
You mentioned that a lot of the things in terms of how Chinese Canadians are portrayed remain the same over the years. Do you notice any changes, any new nuances in terms of how Chinese Canadians are portrayed nowadays?
Well, I guess you've seen, I refuse to go and see Crazy Rich Asians.
I saw it.
I refuse.
Can I say something?
Yes, please, say.
So, you know, I'm always struck by the fact that Simu Liu is now the superhero and the first ever of Chinese Canadian to be named a Marvel superhero. I don't know if you watch the Marvel movies. I do. But anyways, so, I bet you though, like, so this character is called Kung Fu Master, whatever, right? So I see the portrayal in Hollywood or in the mainstream media, entertainment world, Asian Canadians, particularly Chinese Canadians, are superhero in terms of fighting Kung Fu and fighting against the gangsters in Chinatown. So I bet you this is how they are going to portray the superhero.
Maybe not. But there is that kind of nuance where they're afraid to go whole hog and just declare that person a leading man. So if you know Kim's Convenience, you know, heralded, a great Canadian show, you know, syndicated across the States, right? So there's one Asian man who's like the hunk, but they gotta have the sidekick, right? The not so sidekick. Same thing, you know, like it can't go all the way. Aquafina, you know,
Yeah.
hip hop artist, acts, to my eye, a little bit like a coolie. Puts on an act, puts on that act some more for a few films, and now she's playing it straight now. So maybe that's what we're talking about. To get in, you pay your dues by being the, you know, blackface. I don't know. I mean, you know, that coolie face, and then you get to do something straight. And that's not a positive. I think it's just a commentary. I don't know, do you feel that maybe I'm being too harsh?
Sorry, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I already.
Oh. Well, I guess I'm thinking of like two different kinds of stereotypes that's kind of getting rehashed all the time. You can look at mainstream representation is one thing. The other thing is about the connection to, I guess, to your foreign identity, right? So now the conflict is being played out between like Hong Kong Chinese versus mainland Chinese versus Taiwanese people of Chinese ethnic origin, right? And then, you know, and we actually have like people screaming at each other, telling each other to go home at recent rallies. So, and then the other stereotype is the crazy rich Asian thing, right? So we're grappling with quote unquote positive stereotypes, and do you want to have that access to, you know, perceived power, and therefore, you know, turn a blind eye to the diversity and the marginalized communities within our own, you know, diverse communities. I think those are some of the struggle, and the media often doesn't really do a very fair stories to cover that diversity, and I think our communities also internalize a lot of these racism and trying to downplay, you know, things that they consider to be, you know, not favorable, you know, models or stereotypes, right? So they try to hide these things and deny. That makes it really hard for us to address the issues in our own community because we're afraid of racism. Right?
So how do you think that you'd be able to draw that line between what you consider, for example, like stereotypes? There are obviously some very obviously negative ones, for example, like the Kung Fu masters fighting the gangsters in Chinatown. But then there are others that perhaps we would tie into, you know, a Chinese identity. For example, Crazy Rich Asians, I wouldn't necessarily agree that it's an unhealthy stereotype. So how would you be able to draw the line? How do you mobilize people to stand for a cause, and how would you be able to like reconcile their differences on a platform?
Do you mind if So I think, and this is all very interesting. Like, Crazy Rich Asians, I think, had an impossible job because it was kind of the first, like blockbuster level kind of like Asian film, and there was just so much on it that it was trying to represent, and so a film can only be so many things, right? But the problem, one of the many problems that we talk about, like even in terms of the Asian American political construction, right, is that, well, okay, you're the big movie that everybody's going to look at in terms of when we think about Asians, and it's all about East Asians and mainly like rich Chinese Asians. The only Asians of color, the people of color, that are kind of like the disembodied hands that are like servants for these folks, and people think that that's what, and this is not fair, clearly, right? But people get the idea and even internalize the idea that, well, Asians are all doing really well, they're all very wealthy, particularly when you get into diaspora situations, they're kind of all educated, doctor, whatever. But that completely invisibilizes, two things, like the racial disparities that are within the Asian American, but also Asian Canadian community, right? Massive disparities in, socioeconomic indicators, massive disparities when you're talking about facing police, and so, and the other thing is, even within, let's say, the Chinese community, you're not talking about all the people that work, $7 an hour, and in our Chinatowns that have no recourse to possible kind of wage, that are scared as hell of CBSA because all of the immigration and naturalization routes have been cut off to them as low-income immigrants. So these stories are not being told, and that's not necessarily the fault of Crazy Rich Asians. It may be that they have to do the little caricature and do the fun thing to get into the game before, for instance, Awkwafina had her big yeah.
Farewell. well.
And that was a more, you could say, slice of life from the heart type of project, where you're able to discuss and share with everybody a very nuanced, very a diverse set of stories that reflects broader reality.
And the impact of portraying Asian is again because of racism. I personally encountered asking for funding from foundation for services for Chinese Canadian seniors and was told that Chinese Canadians do not need the money because you guys are rich. It's this portrayal, of course it's a totally racist portrayal, but it doesn't help to have, this Hollywood portrayal of rich Asian, right?
So before I jump to that question, I just want to bring back that point. So how do we make the jump? So like previously at CCNC, like even what Amy is saying, it seems more of like Chinese community versus the government. Like if there's arguably a very clear wrong in this case, but how do we reconcile more within this community, right? So like, our internal conflicts with, other people of Asian descent, but perhaps are lighter, darker skin. How are we going to take the next step? Because like you said, we've fought these like past battles, but this one is a little bit different because to some extent we're fighting each other. So how are we going to move the movement forward?
Can I just say something before you say that? Okay, before anybody answers the question. So, Black people are third on the list here, and just in connection to everything that you said, even to relate to Black people who are in media. For example, we just got Black Panther, right? And at first, I think for Black people it was a woohoo, like we got it, we're in there, we finally made it, But then people were like, look at the bigger scale. Do you really think you're in there, or are they using you to make more money for themselves? Like they're only doing it to satisfy you, so you feel like you're a monk. So I think in your question, it's almost like, so how do we take that back? You know what I mean? And the God honest truth is, people who are ignorant there needs to be, I don't know if there's going to be a movement, I don't know how people are going to do it, but there needs to be some sort of, I don't know, sorry, somebody help me with a word. It's like people who are ignorant and you're trying to let them know, like, if you don't know about our culture, don't try to use us. Don't make movies about us. Don't talk about us because you don't know nothing about us. Let us make our own movies and let us tell you about our culture. And I feel like that's how you take back your power.
Mm-hmm. That's an absolutely important point. And one of the things that we did over the years was to recognize that a lot of the causation, though not the excuse, was institutional racism. So if you target the racism and presumptions within education, within the police, within government, within media, you start to try to get towards a solution. So you need to identify these things rather than fighting among yourselves.
Right. It just sounds like it's an inside job.
like, that's all. That's all I have to say.
Yeah. Give us more context.
No, I'm sorry. Y'all know what that means. It just sounds like it needs to be an inside job.
It does.
Well, I think people sitting around here probably educated.
Yeah.
I mean, we're here in a university setting, in an institution, so we gotta recognize that. And I think that the stories about movements to kind of lend voice, and we're not lending the voice to voiceless, they need to have their own voice. Mm-hmm. But I think those stories about how you start that movement, there are people marginalized and they can't talk. Like, I've been in mental health for 30 plus years, 100 years old. But, I just got here 4 years ago, married my wife, and just became a citizen. And, they don't do news about this 88 of us, good number for Chinese, from 29 countries. I was sworn in by a native, a First Nation woman. I mean, that is what Canadian is about or becoming. That's a great story. But that's just every day, boring stuff. It doesn't make news. I think news is inflammatory stuff. And I have to say the recent thing about that, I think he looks Asian, but something that, when it throws you off a little bit, there's something, and people you don't hear it a week later. is that man that escaped from Cambridge. He got on a plane and then he left, and then Doug Ford, called him an animal, and he's crazy, and I think one person came out and said that doesn't do well for mental health and stuff like that. And I just feel like if that was a white person, I do see some racism there. If that was a white person in the news, that would have been another kind of response. Like, we need better funding for mental health. You know what I mean?
There's also, I think we're starting to tread on, full disclosure, we want you to agree with us. There is a need to have a national organization that's a progressive voice that will speak out against racism. So if that issue were to come up in the media, our organization in the past and of course in the future would respond to that on behalf of our membership and it would be a place where we could do these things out, identify some of the issues, identify targets. It's a movement, it's an organization, it's a collective, call it what you like, but what it means is there's a place where you can go to get help on these kinds of issues. An organization that will speak on your behalf around these issues and mount campaigns as necessary towards a resolution, as we did over the many years. Right? So we want you to agree with us by the end of this session, and Amy will have a lot more to talk about that in a minute. But that's what we're proposing. But we want to hear from you what it is you think we should be doing, what it is you'd be prepared to be doing.
Baby, do you want?
Go ahead, Amy.
So I guess, some of you are, when you came in, you saw the fact sheets outside, which is the color coffee, color change. So this is an organization that our clinic, the Chinese and Southeast Asian Clinic, started in 2006, 2007, with a number of other racialized communities to try to address some of the issues that we're discussing today: racism in policing, racism in criminal justice, poverty issue, and so on and so forth. And part of the reason why I think that the color coffee came to exist is because we are lacking that kind of voices out there. For many years, for instance, we used to have the National Action Committee for the Status of Women, NAG, which was a national organization that talked about issue of racism, sexism, and sort of other forms of discrimination. Many of these organizations during the Harper time basically were dismantled. And I think that kind of created a vacuum. A lot of the organizations that worked very closely together, I remember when I was with the CCNC Toronto chapter, with groups like Black Action Defense Committee, like there was a lot more coalition building in those days, partly because there was also funding available for these organizations to work together. But for the last many years, that sort of community support was gone. So some of us tried to fill in the gap by putting our own resources together and keep talking about racism, institutionalized racism, and so on and so forth. And I think one of the key things that we want to push for, and maybe CCNC and other groups can take up, is we feel very strongly that the institutions themselves need to be changed. And the only way to change that is to force them to change by having sort of
empower the more marginalized and the poorer and the more disenfranchised portion of our community get left behind, like what Vince was saying earlier. And if we play by this power broker model, then it's easier for the government to ignore the invisible part and continue to erase the presence, right? And because of social media, people, there is a tool that is a double-edged sword, really.
Yeah.
Right? You can really use it to mobilize and have a whole revolution. You can also just start talking to all the people who agrees with you and don't build dialogues and don't challenge, differences, right? So I think, it's both in the digital world, we are more isolated in a way, and at the same time we are more
collective too.
Yeah. So it is, but I think like I work a lot with new immigrants and refugees and
Right.
people who are undocumented.
Yeah.
And recently we started a clinic for people who are undocumented, and I actually see the kind of galvanizing and the community activism that I haven't seen in almost like 20 years happening again, because people see a real need and people really feel that there is the sense of social justice and compassion that can still draw people together. But like if people just happily in school and then looking at their Facebook all the time and Instagram or whatever latest thing, then you could be very content, and be very complacent that the problems of the world is out there. It doesn't necessarily affect us, especially like I think we need to acknowledge our own social positions and access to power and privilege, right? Years happening again because people see a real need and people really feel that there is the sense of social justice and compassion that can still draw people together. But like if people just happily in school and then looking at their Facebook all the time and Instagram or whatever latest thing, then you could be very content, and be very complacent that the problems of the world is out there. It doesn't necessarily affect us, especially like I think we need to acknowledge our own social positions and access to power and privilege, right?
Yeah. So maybe I'll try to lean towards an answer towards the question.
Go on.
I think maybe 3 years ago, some young, kind of Asian, I don't know if you can call activists, like we were like, we didn't know what the hell we're doing. But we wanted to get together and meet other kind of progressive Asian folks that are around the Toronto area, and we got like a broad subset of people, and like there was a predominance of East Asian, but there were also South Asian folks. There were like Asians of like a darker complexion, so which faced just very different kind of challenges because of that. And then so we were kind of rehashing what I would later realize is like a debate like that is super long, like, about the debate between kind of intersectionality and like anti-essentialism. Like basically, like if categories by themselves will always kind of like leave out nuance and create like a imbalance where the most powerful within that category will kind of like eat up all the space and resources and that. And but there's still like usefulness in those categories, right? So I worked with Professor Crenshaw who came up with kind of the intersectionality idea, and it's basically like, okay, it's okay that we have all of kind of these different categories so long as we understand that when people are situated in the confluence of different kind of categories, their experience is going to be different. And we just have to take understand and appreciate that difference, and also what is the values behind it. Is it actually like an emancipatory kind of politics that we're all moving towards, right? And hence the idea of I like the idea that it's Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice, because if it's just and this happens over time because like organizations, people change, but if it's just an affinity group, right? Let's say Chinese Canadians. And without any kind of other like underlying value, then it's just like it becomes like the strongest, most rich, most educated people like hanging out, and this is like what we think, right? Or it becomes like a networking kind of thing, right? Which is is good too. But if it's not animated by a cause, emancipatory politics, equity for like all, especially the most marginalized, then what are we doing, right? So that's kind of where we, and then eventually that group, it kind of broke apart when I went to New York, but like we still keep in touch, you know what I mean? Like we met each other. It was a place to hang out, chill, have these kind of discussions that I think weren't really happening, at least in the Chinese community, to any extent that I knew of, other than the folks in this room, and that was really helpful. Like everybody has gone on to do different amazing things with their particular organizations and what they care about, but we still act in solidarity. We'll still help each other. We'll still connect each other. So that's what I see from, I don't know, like a younger, I don't know, whatever my generation is. Well, that's the generation.
So I think that there's also an element here of people who themselves are not themselves truly marginalized. We've got doctors, you've got lawyers, you know, PhDs and so on, who were prepared to be part of a movement, and they did it on behalf of those who were marginalized. And the movement was important because of that altruism. And the importance of that altruism, we would never challenge for, you know, conflicts of interest. We were never challenged that we're pocketing any of this. If anything, you know, we were out there putting ourselves out on the line. And it's important to see that that's really also the history here and also what we propose for the future. There's an element here when we talk about the days before when they used to fund us and what we do now. One of the things that I've learned of late is that you need to be able to represent X number of people to have clout. So when we're talking about media, when we're talking about politicians, politics and so on, mostly people will say to you after you confront them with your, you know, your loud statement, they say, oh yeah, you and who's army,
Yeah.
right? Now, it is possible to have a really strong army of people who believe as you do, who are prepared to act, not, you know, in lockstep with you, but who are prepared to hear. One of my previous positions was with an organization against age discrimination. You graduate into that versus racism. And one of the things that was important was that we had an email list that reached 150,000 emails, and if you assume 1 or 2 people in each household, some possible 300,000 people would hear your message. And I never had to say to politicians or media, look, you know, all these people are going to do something just because I say so.
Right.
But what I could say to them is that here was my question, here's your answer, I don't like it, and what's more, I'm going to send it out by email to all these other people who care as I do, and you can deal with them directly.
Right.
Right? So that's the clout that we have now. That costs nothing. But what it costs is time to organize those email addresses, to keep the list going so that people continue to have their views represented, that they still hear what's happening next, so that if somebody has a question about a magazine article or a television program or something that they see on the net, that it can be shared, it can be reacted to as a group. And that's the opportunity here. There's no, you know, muzzling of anybody or speaking on behalf of anybody. Anything that is said will be open to everybody to criticize. But that's the kind of challenge that we're facing now. That's also the opportunity we have now.
I think also like an issue about clouds and how it goes back to this idea of fragmentation though. So my issue, and I guess I'd like to hear from speakers, this might be our last one given our time. So I agree with Alan in particular, that the fragmentation comes from this complacency, right? So we have this division of like successful people. I can't speak for all the diversity groups, but the Asian groups, I feel like in particular, is this idea that you don't want to be too Asian. For example, like even for like events, even for Asia Law Society, I can't actually access, I would say like half of the Asian community in U of T Law, just because, you know, you don't want to come across as like, oh, all I do is hang out with Asian people, as like, you know, and you're in this little clique or something like that. So, like I said, I guess initially it was always like, you know, we're being oppressed by someone else. How do we get this group that doesn't feel oppressed? They, you know, like I am Asian, I made it, I didn't really feel like there was like, you know, there may have been barriers, but I got through them. So how do we, you know, how do we get these people to be interested in helping out, you know, those who are less fortunate, those who are left behind?
But are you guys like talking to each other? Like, is there dialogue between those fragmented groups? Like,
so that might be one of the issues. And like, so how do we address that?
There's one of the things that we have an opportunity to share. I think the opportunity today is that we can share this dialogue, you know, throughout any number of groups. You know, we're not limited to the, you know, 80 people in this room, where we can continue in our various groups and continue the dialogue. And so long as there's a strong presence, we can argue these issues out. People will feel that they belong in bits, maybe not entirely, but that's part of the process. So you choose issues that we agree upon, take a position on it, and if anybody who agrees with that position is welcome to join. You had a question back there?
Yeah,
This gentleman is me.
to Ryan's point about how, I think a very important step is also to first recognize how you get to that position of privilege, right? So like, you say that, okay, I'm successful, I'm at UT Law, I eventually get a job at a big law firm, but then you recognize the privilege that you've had to get there, and very often, as I'm sure a lot of UT Law students would know, when we go through the recruit process, we're told to, maybe we need to whiten our application, or maybe we need to, I was once told that the best part about it, the most crucial part about a law firm interview is to make white people feel comfortable, right? If you do that, then you succeed at the interview. And I feel like a lot of, being conscious of that privilege, being conscious of what it took. So this goes back to, I think, the Hollywood thing, right? Like you played the sort of stereotypical character first before you can, actually make the movies you want, write the scripts that you want. I feel like being cognizant of the sacrifices you have to make to get to that position of privilege in the first place is a very important part of starting that dialogue.
Right. No, you're absolutely right, and just being able to reflect on that and talking about that and not being embarrassed by that. I mean, it's a challenge to the system, not that that you have anything to apologize for, but it is exactly what we're all confronting. Adora, and I think Winnie, you had a question too, both of you.
Okay, I just wanted to say this. Any of us who have made it through law school, dentistry school, pharmacy, or whatever, we owe an obligation to those who paved the way for us. So by the fact that you got into these professions, you owe it to the future generations to ensure that those privileges are not taken away from us, because they can be. We're all standing on these little mats, and economically, politically, socially, that mat can be pulled out from under our feet at any time. So when I went to law school, I was very cognizant of the fact that my great uncle had to die in Germany because he was a fighter pilot, and they didn't allow him, they wouldn't conscript him, but he joined anyways, 23 years old, and he's buried in Berlin. So that generation fought so that someone like me and my cousins could go to law school or dentistry school or medical school. So you need to remember that. People died and paved the way for you to have the privilege that you are able to enjoy today, and you owe an obligation to the future generations to make sure that that privilege is not taken away.
Winnie?
Yeah, I just want to make a comment responding to Gary's observations and the fragmentation. I think we also need to, there's no doubt 40 years ago the anti-W5 movement was a watershed movement. It's sort of like the coming out of the Chinese Canadian community to a new level and sort of erasing, countering some of that old prejudice and racism stereotypes within sort of the ghetto, quote unquote, the Chinatown area. Now, if we're in relaunching CCNC for social justice, if we be bold and look ahead 40 years from now, and I think we need to recognize the fragmentations that we are talking about. We need to put it in the larger national political context. You now have a new normal where, Maxime Bernier's party can feel that they can, it's a new normal that they are so emboldened by Harris, by Ford, and so on and so forth, that they can talk about, like the new level of normal and saying, we can't have all these refugees, we can't have, all the different racist rhetorics that are coming up, not just during this election, but what happened in Quebec with the passing of Bill 21. These, to me, I think we are now in an era where politics is operated in the, under division and fear. And so how do we build and overcome that fragmentations and build much more solid solidarity or alliances with all the different groups? I think to me, one of the key pieces that we need to look at is what CCNC's position as a Chinese Canadian community, our relationship with the indigenous decolonization that's taking place? What's our relationship? How do we build in supporting that projects, that decolonizations, that the indigenous, when you have 1/3 of the indigenous community still have no access to clean water. What's our obligations? Now that we know, we can't afford to be complicit, what are we gonna do? Just like, how do we stand in solidarity with, Black Lives Matter and all the other groups that we've been building over the years, but in the next 10 years, if we have different political governments in power and, playing on this divide and rule.
So I think we're running out of time, so I'd like to hear from each of our speakers as to how we address, the fragmentation and basically how we can work with other groups and move forward.
I'll go first. I totally agree with Winnie's point of view there, because I feel that, okay, when we did the Chinese Canadian National Council, based on our identity, based on what we think the society should be, but I can tell you racism always bugs you. I mean, even for me, okay, you can say, oh, she's made it, she got a job, she can do what she wants to do, but all the time, it's at the back of your head, you go out and people will still look at me differently, okay? And that's structural, that's something that is done, that is, you are in this milieu, you're in this matrix, okay?
Yeah.
It's all built up for tens of or hundreds of years of opinions, of things, whatever you call it. So, well, that's why I get into the science of racism, okay? To understand the how does it work? But I think the important thing is to develop our empathy with other groups. Yes, of course, we look at ourselves, we know what our values are and we work on it, but I think we have to get out of that as well. Okay, so I'm not saying not to have the CCNC for social justice is important. Like somebody said, a broad categorization is not a bad thing. We make use of it, but we're not just stopping there. We have to look at other things. We have to really get into other, improve ourselves.
I see the main value of having an organization like CCNC as having a home base where we could nurture, people with common values and vision, and be a home base where different courses and communities can connect to. Because the difficulty of building coalition is when you don't have a home, then you can, people doesn't know how to reach you, right? And I think that we, as much as we are here, we are all very well educated, we are kind of, elite advocates almost. I think the important thing is that if we really truly want a massive movement, then we need to connect to the real people, and I think that we have forgotten community development and empowerment in a lot of our activism, and that's also led to the fragmentation. So in some of my work, I still connect and work with people who are actually facing a lot of barriers, and the amount of inspiration and resilience that you witness actually are very empowering. And I think that sometimes kind of keeps me grounded and keeps me going. So I would encourage all of us to continue to really dialogue and connect with people who are really, really facing that, dire needs and survival threats in their everyday life. And I think that keeps us grounded and keep our causes relevant and real.
Yeah, I'm just gonna follow up on what Alan said. I think that's exactly it. You don't need to feel like the oppression yourself necessarily in order to do social justice work, right? You're privileged, use that privilege in a responsible way. And the way you do that, and the way you keep it real, is you gotta go into the communities. So I just wanna flag T-Base, right? So T-Base is a community arts collective, is Asian, it's queer, and they set themselves up in Chinatown Center, right? The Chinatown Center, we all know, Spadina, it's been kind of going downhill in terms of the infrastructure there for a while, right? And they instead of setting, they actually in a gallery or whatever, they situated themselves there because they needed to be rooted in the community for all its kind of so it's really funky, right? Like if you go there, you know, they give tea, they do art, they do like all these sorts of like amazing, intergenerational kind of poetry, mahjong, and then you know like the folks, the kind of like the old folks in Chinatown, they all go to Chinatown Center and they're just like what are these young people? What are they doing? They're just like so confused. And then they talk to them back in like their broken like Chinese or whatever. It's like hilarious. But like that's kind of, and then kind of the work that CCNC Toronto has been doing with grocery store workers outreach, with what was the others? Nail salon workers with Chinese Southeast Asian legal clinic. The work that we do with Butterfly and migrant sex workers, massage parlors, and also the underground kind of sex work is enormous parts of the Chinese community. Like these are people that are in the community right now doing that kind of work, and it's incumbent on us to kind of support that work, learn about it, and where we have the privilege to center those voices, center those needs, right? To use our platforms, to use our tools in order to bring to life and to bring to light these really, really important issues that otherwise would not, clearly would not get any kind of political attention. So I
think maybe just add one thing. I think the important thing is to also really honor those lived experience and share the air and share that platform, right? So if we have access to those voices, we really should put the people who have the direct lived experience there as much as possible.
We're talking about sharing the air, that's great. We're going to close the formal part of the session. Amy has a few announcements about some of the things that we will be carrying on in the next little while. We encourage you to sign up, and Ryan can tell you more about that. I want to introduce some of the people in the audience that you can chat with. These are people who have been part of the organization over the last 40 years. Starting first with Dr. Joseph Wong, who scooted in to finish his clinic first. God forbid if you're one of his patients, my God. All day long he's working, but he's here, and he was one of the driving forces, along with Lillian, at the very first demands for an apology from W5, and has helped to sustain the organization over the many years, and many other things that he has gone on to found, and then dragged us all into midnight meetings to organize. Keith Wong, right here, who has been streaming this on Facebook, so I guess it's kind of the same, right? Doran Nip and did Winnie leave? No, there you are, hiding. Also part of the CCNC-SJ. And Barry Lee, who was president for a period of time, especially when we were dealing with the head tax redress campaign, and as part of the outreach, he had to make speeches within the community, and obviously to the older people, because they're the ones who would be most affected by the head tax in Chinese. So as part of his sacrifice, he actually learned to give speeches in Chinese, and that is no small thing. Yeah. In the back there, she was also one of our presidents, and also now head of the Chinese Legal Clinic, and a force to be reckoned with. And both those were also presidents during
Of course, especially from Ottawa. Very much involved in the CCNC Ottawa chapter, one of our leaders in Ottawa, helped out with the redress campaign, and continue to support social justice. Thank you. So thank you very much, the panel, and Susan and Ryan for co-facilitating. And thank you, Ryan, for the support from Asia Law Society, Osler, as well as the Center for International Human Rights here for having this event here. It is definitely a very special moment, September 30th, 40 years ago, that we watched W5 campus giveaway in horror. Some of you were not born, but it was definitely a defining moment for Chinese Canadians, and it continues to, unfortunately, haunt us because in many ways it's now rear its head in different ramifications, different manifestations, as we have heard throughout this evening. So definitely there is a need to continue this fight. Yesterday I was at CCNC Toronto chapter. It was the AGM, and Dr. Wong was giving the history about W5 and the formation of CCNC in front of a large group of Mandarin-speaking seniors. And one of the speakers, other than me, was from Butterfly, talking about the plight of migrant sex trade worker and the racism that they face, and the massage parlors, because they were run by Asian, because they were Asian women, they were subjected to hundreds of unfair inspections from the city of Toronto. And of course, whose life was most at risk are those sex trade workers, and their livelihood, their families, and their status, everything was at risk. It was an amazing, panel at the end. So the speakers, of course, was trying to impress upon these seniors that regardless of our profession, regardless of our background, we should all be treated with fairness, with justice, with equality and all that. And we should, because we are here in Canada with human rights protection. And it was very interesting and eye-opening experience to hear the response from the seniors, and they asked, is it legal to be a sex trade worker here? Well, if it's legal, then we should, of course, we should subject to the same protection, right? And then another senior was saying, well, I don't know. Why are we always targeting the Chinese government? What I'm hearing is that Canada is not much better than China. So, just from that conversation alone, I learned how, this fragmentation that we talked about, and of course, how the globalization, the interiorization, whatever, the global economy has impacted on the political reality, social, and unfortunately, the lives of Canadians and the lives of people of color, racialized groups like us. And so selfishly speaking, we should all continue this fight, because regardless, being a social worker for 40 years in 30 years in senior management, I still confront racism and discrimination, even now in my consulting business, and I'm sure in all yours. So when you go out to Bay Street, how many of Chinese Canadians are on the partnership, And I think we all gonna, so don't think that we have made it. It's, we still have a long way to say that we have made it. Unfortunately, there are lots of people, as Alan said, who have not even made it to where we are today, and we cannot forget about them. So there's lots of things ahead from us, and Victoria, thank you for taking notes and helping out. So what we are trying to do is to gather your feedback and your ideas, and so that we can put together some projects to seek funding, because right now we have absolutely zero funding. We need the resources, so we will be pursuing that, and we will collaborate with groups and and solidarity with other communities. So that's one thing that we are going to do after tonight, and moving forward. As well, we are continuing to recruit people like you, particularly I shouldn't say particularly, but the young people, we need all of you. So we have sign-in sheets, if you're interested to continue the dialogue and help us, please leave your contact email so we can build that 150,000 emails list, hopefully someday. And of course, we can also recruit you in our projects and our collaborative journey forward. And just also want to say that on November 1st, our first collaborative forum will be held at Ryerson, part of their Social Justice Week. On the panel, 4 powerful women lawyers all happen to be. AV will be there speaking about W5 redress and the Chinese Canadian community's fight for justice. We have a lawyer from the indigenous Aboriginal legal services who will of course share with us the important work that they are pursuing and the solidarity movement that we all need to build together. And we also have a Korean Canadian women lawyer who is now working for LEAD, Legal Education Action Fund, speaking from the Asian Canadian perspective around anti-Asian racism and the work that as a young activist, her journey and her role in this process. And we also have Marika Omatsu, who is a provincial judge, who is very active and one of the leaders of the Japanese Canadian redress movement. So we are hoping that this is again to build the momentum, to build the collaborative work moving forward, and I hope that you will all be there on November 1st from 2:30 to 4:30 at Oakham Lounge in Ryerson. And I don't think there is a registration. I think it's just open. So please do come, and there will be refreshments. So thank you. And so thank you all very much. And I just have to.